Hello and welcome to your Chapter 34 video lecture series on animal nutrition and the digestive system. We'll start with section 1 on digestive systems. We know that animals are going to get their nutrition by consuming other organisms. And so we've classified these animals in these 3 different categories. But before we get into that, let's cover our learning objectives. First, we want to explain the processes of digestion and absorption. Second, compare and contrast different types of digestive systems. 3, explain the specialized functions of the organs involved in processing food in the body. And 4, describe the ways in which organs work together to digest food and absorb nutrients. So like I said, we'll go into those 3 different classifications. First, we have our herbivores, and these are animals whose primary food source is plant-based, meaning that their digestive systems have to be capable of handling large amounts of plant material. So we can think of the animals that are vertebrates like deer, koalas, and some bird species, as well as our invertebrates such as crickets and caterpillars. And these are further classified into these 4 different categories: frugivores, that are fruit eaters, granivores, that are seed eaters, nectivores, that are nectar feeders, and folivores, that are leaf eaters. The other category are our carnivores, and these are animals that eat other animals or meat. The word carnivore is derived from a Latin term that literally means meat eater. And examples of this would be our vertebrates such as lions and tigers, snakes, and sharks. And invertebrates would include sea stars, spiders, and ladybugs. We can further classify carnivores into obligate carnivores, which mean that they solely eat meat. So that would include our lions and cheetahs and other wild cats. And we've got our facultative carnivores, which mean they can eat non-animal food in addition to animal food. So an example of this type of carnivore would be dogs. And lastly, we have our omnivores, which would probably be what we are placed in, depending on your diet. But these are going to be the animals that eat both plant and animal-derived foods. In Latin, omnivore means they eat everything. So like I said, it's going to include vertebrates like us, our bears and chickens, and invertebrates such as cockroaches and crayfish. Now let's take a look at some of the different digestive systems. First, with our invertebrate digestive systems. They are going to have something called a gastrovascular cavity, and this is going to be found as just one opening for digestion, and it's also going to be an area where we can essentially defecate. So the mouth and anus is one opening. And inside this cavity, we are going to have cells lining this area that can secrete digestive enzymes to break down the food. And then the smaller food particles are going to be engulfed by these cells and utilized within cellular processes. Examples of animals that have this gastrovascular cavity would include our platyhelminths, which are also known as flatworms, ctenophora, which are known as comb jellies, and our cnidaria, which include our coral, jellyfish, and sea anemones. And then we have our alimentary canal, which we can see in this figure of a nematode over here. Within our alimentary canal, we are going to see that it is made up of a tube that is going to have a mouth at one end and an anus at the other. So food will be ingested through the mouth and pass through the esophagus and then into an organ called the crop, and then it'll pass into a gizzard in which it will be churned and digested, and then it will move into this intestines where the nutrients will be absorbed, and eventually we get the feces or the waste product that gets eliminated through the anus, and this is going to be called castings. Examples of this would also include our earthworms. And now let's get into our vertebrate digestive system. So we'll start off with our monogastric or single-chambered stomachs. This is probably what you are familiar with since we are set up this way. Our digestive is going to begin in the mouth by ingesting the food, and then our teeth will mash or chew that food. Our saliva within our mouth also will help to secrete enzymes to chemically break down food. And through these methods, we break the food down into smaller particles, and it's now able to move into the esophagus. This can happen in other monogastric vertebrate animals as well. And that then is going to allow the food to move down through a process known as peristalsis, which is a wave-like smooth muscle contraction that pushes the food in a one-way direction down into the stomach. In the stomach, we will have an acidic environment with a pH of 1.5 to 2.5 that will activate certain enzymes in here to help further break down food. From there, we move into the small intestines, which also will have enzymes within it that usually get secreted from the liver and the pancreas, and we'll talk about that in detail in the coming slides. And as that food moves into smaller and smaller pieces or particles, it is going to then absorb into the bloodstream. Now we are left with some water and waste products, so we are going to absorb that water within the large intestines, and the rest of the waste is going to be compacted as feces, which will be defecated via the rectum and the anus. Now let's talk about a different type of digestive system known as avian. Birds do not have teeth, so their digestive system have to be able to process unmasticated chewed. What that means is unchewed food. So we see that birds have a variety of beaks to assist in whatever diet that they have. Maybe it's for eating seeds or insects, fruits, or nuts. But we do have in common that these two chambered stomachs exist. So the first one is going to be called our proventriculus, and this is going to have gastric juices within it that can digest the food before it's going to enter what we think of as a true stomach, which is the gizzard. And this is where we're going to store that food. It gets soaked and mechanically ground up using muscle. And then our undigested material is going to form pellets that are sometimes regurgitated. And the rest of the digestive system will be similar to what we know. So the small intestines here is going to absorb the rest of the nutrients, and the rest of the waste products will be excreted through an opening known as the cloaca. And then for our ruminants, they are going to be mainly herbivores like cows, sheep, and goats, whose entire diet is going to consist of eating large amounts of roughage or fiber. So we have to be able to digest vast amounts of cellulose, since we find that within plants, and they don't have upper incisor teeth, so that would make it very difficult to eat meat. So their stomach actually has 4 different compartments or 4 different chambers. We have the rumen, reticulum, omasum, and the abomasum. And this is going to contain microbes that break down cellulose and ferment the indigested food. The abomasum is actually the true stomach, where we are going to have similar processes as our monogastric stomach that we know of, where we're going to secrete gastric juices and also have some churning take place. Now, the reason that we have these 4 different compartments too is so that we have a larger amount of surface area or larger space, so that we can have microbial support in order to break down all of the roughage and fiber. And those microbes that help us with digestion, like we said, will help ferment our food, and that fermentation process can produce large amounts of gas within the stomach chamber, and it has to be eliminated. So once we move through the 4 different stomachs, we are going to move into the small intestines, where we absorb nutrients, and then out the large intestines, in which we eliminate waste products or feces out the anus. And the last type is going to be our pseudo-ruminants, and this is for animals that eat a lot of plant material and roughage as well. It's going to include camels, alpacas, and horses. And we don't have the digestive enzymes here to break down the cellulose, but we do have a lot of microorganisms within the gastrointestinal tract that are able to break it down. So these animals tend to have 3 chamber stomachs, and that is going to include our omasum, the abomasum, and the reticulum. So we're missing that rumen. And again, the same thing is going to hold true where the abomasum is going to be the true stomach. And just like our previous digestive systems, the small intestines will absorb nutrients and the large intestines will eliminate waste. The one difference here is that in these animals, they will have a very large cecum. Now, we haven't talked about the large intestines as a whole yet, but the cecum is this blind pouch that starts the large intestines. It's its origin, where it begins, and it is going to contain a lot of microorganisms that will again help to ferment and digest the roughage that they consume. Now let's shift gears and talk about the digestive system details. This is going to be specific to humans. So starting at the beginning of our digestive system is the oral cavity. This is where we're going to receive food and be able to mechanically and chemically digest. The roof of our mouth is going to help separate out our nasal cavity from our oral cavity. So this upper portion here where we have bone is known as the hard palate. It is made up of a bone called the maxilla and the palatine bone. And beyond that, we have our soft palate. And notice at the back of the soft palate, we have this structure called the uvula. When you're looking inside your mouth and ever wondered what that ball in the back of your throat is, that's called your uvula. And your uvula swings upward to close up entrance into the nasal cavity when you are eating food or drinking liquids. The other thing we'll find in here are tonsils. So here we could see our palatine tonsils. Just know that you have lymphatic tissue here that's going to help us be protected from disease or pathogens entering our oral cavity. We of course have our teeth too that will help us mechanically break down food, and then our tongue, which we will have taste buds on here. We'll go through that process a little bit more in anatomy, and the tongue is going to help us mechanically break down food. Now it does produce one enzyme known as lingual lipase, and that is going to help to break down fat, or our triglycerides. Within our mouth, we also have salivary glands. There's 3 pairs of them. Starting with our parotid gland, we find that anterior to the ear, close to the cheek area. And below our mandible bone, which you can see has been cut out of the way here for us to see it better, is our submandibular gland. And lastly, we have our sublingual gland. Whenever you see the word lingual, you want to think tongue. So we find this below the tongue. And so the function of our salivary glands is to produce saliva. Our saliva is going to contain mucus that helps to moisten our food and kind of clump the food together, and also buffers the pH. We'll also see an enzyme known as salivary amylase secreted that will start the carbohydrate digestion, turning starches into disaccharides known as maltose. We also will have antibacterial properties where we produce lysozyme and immunoglobulin A to protect us from pathogens. And as we are mechanically chemically digesting, we're going to form a clump of food known as the bolus. And our tongue is going to help to move that back toward the pharynx. All right, so your book doesn't talk extensively about the pharynx, but I think it's important to understand the anatomy here. So our mouth, we said, is going to be right within here. Our tongue is pictured here. There's our hard palate, our soft palate, and that uvula. Up here is our nasal cavity. And then we have these pieces of cartilage down in this region. So I'm just going to let you know that this area is our larynx, and below that is going to be the trachea. And all of this is our pharynx that leads down to the esophagus. So we really have 2 openings from the pharynx inferiorly or below it. So let's start off. I just want to describe these areas of the pharynx. This in blue is called our nasopharynx. It is found posterior to the nasal cavity. And then we've got our oropharynx that is posterior to the oral cavity, and lastly our laryngopharynx that is posterior to the larynx. So as we eat food or drink fluid, we are going to see that the larynx has this leaf-like structured cartilage piece known as the epiglottis. And the epiglottis shifts downward to protect the larynx and the trachea, which will take us to the lungs eventually, so that food and water or any other fluid moves posteriorly or toward the back into the esophagus rather than moving down into our voice box and windpipe. And from the pharynx, like we said, here at the laryngopharynx, we are going to move into the esophagus, this muscular tube over here. So the esophagus essentially will move that food down to the stomach. And it does this through peristalsis, so this involuntary wave-like motion, and it's unidirectional, meaning that food can only move in one direction, and it helps to shift that food down into the stomach. So we see part of the stomach down over here. It's being guarded, I guess we could say, through an area or a muscle known as a sphincter. So we call this sphincter either the lower esophageal sphincter, gastroesophageal sphincter, or cardiac sphincter because it's located close to the heart, and cardi refers to the heart. So what we could do is when we contract this muscle, it is going to close off this opening. But as our esophagus feels the pressure of that bolus moving down, it is going to relax this muscle so that we can open this lumen and allow the food to move into the stomach. Now, sometimes we have a faulty lower esophageal sphincter, and it is not closing properly when there's no food present. And so some of the acidic contents of the stomach moves back into the esophagus. And that is how we can feel heartburn. If it's really bad, we can also start forming ulcers within the tissue there. Let's move into the stomach. This organ is going to help to store food and start digestion of proteins. Remember, before this, we only had amylases and lipases. So we only started breaking down our carbs and our fats. So this is the first time we're breaking down proteins. We're also going to control the movement of food into the small intestines. Note that we are not absorbing any of the nutrients here, but we can absorb alcohol because it's fat soluble and can pass through the membranes easily. As far as mechanical digestion, the stomach has 3 different layers of muscles: oblique, circular, and longitudinal, that will churn that food. And our stomach is really unique in that when it's empty, it's pretty small, but it can expand up to 20 times its resting size when we fill it with food. Now, our stomach is going to churn about every 20 minutes, but normally our stomach empties in about 2 to 6 hours. And that food in here is now liquefied, and we call it chyme. I know it looks like chime, but it's pronounced chyme. And it's a mixture of the food and the gastric juices that gives it more of that liquid type of solution. And this is all safeguarded by another sphincter known as the pyloric sphincter. The word pyloric or pylorus means gatekeeper. So it is certainly monitoring the gate as far as how much fluid or chyme it's going to allow to move into the small intestines. And here's just a little illustration of that liquid chyme in the stomach. All right, now let's talk about the mucosa a little bit. Let me go back a few images here. When we talk about the mucosa, we're talking about that inner lining of the stomach. So this is a nice close-up. Notice how we do have these dips within it. And then right below that epithelial lining, we have blood vessels. So taking us back to the slide here, those deep folds are called rugae, and our mucosa has gastric pits, and they contain the gastric glands, and they're in charge of producing gastric juice. So we are going to have certain cells. Oops, let me see if my animations are going to work properly here. Certain cells in here known as our chief cells that are going to produce an inactive enzyme known as pepsinogen, and then our other cells known as parietal cells are going to be in charge of producing gastric acid or hydrochloric acid. This is going to work twofold because one, it helps to kill the bacteria or pathogens within our stomach, and the other thing is it is going to take pepsinogen and activate it to turn it into an enzyme known as pepsin. Now, pepsin is going to play a major role in digesting our proteins. And it was Theodore Schwann that named the enzyme pepsin in 1836 after the Greek word pepsis, which means digestion. And you may be wondering, well, why do we have to go through this activation process? Why not just have pepsin? And that is because pepsin is so strong that if we do not have food within the stomach, let's say you have an empty stomach, pepsin can start to digest the inner lining of our stomach. So that's why we have it inactive until we need it. And then we also have mucus that is going to be secreted, and this helps to protect the lining from that mucosal digestion that we mentioned. If we do have a rupture within the mucosal lining, we can get an ulcer that gets formed. One of the bacteria that can live within the mucus and cause this to happen is our Helicobacter pylori. All my animations are off. I'm sorry. Hold on. Okay, here we go. So here is our bacterium, Helicobacter pylori. And then that can sit within the mucosal lining and cause ulcers to take place. This image up here is just showing you some of those gastric pits within the mucosa. All right, let's move into our small intestines now. Our small intestines is 6 meters long, and it's where digestion of protein, fats, and carbs is completed. We have 3 different parts to our small intestines. First one is the duodenum, and it's pretty short and it's C-shaped here. This is where chyme is going to be released from the stomach, and it starts to mix with pancreatic juices in an alkaline-rich solution in bicarbonate, and this helps to neutralize the acidic chyme that was coming from the stomach. So it really acts as a buffer. We're also going to mix with other digestive enzymes and bile. We're going to talk a bit more in detail in the coming slides on this process. Next, we have the jejunum, and within the jejunum, we will have hydrolysis, or the breakdown of nutrients, continuing, and most of our carbs and amino acids are being absorbed. Then our last part is the ileum. Notice that it is spelled with an E. With an I would refer to a part of our os coxa, or our hip bone. So this last part is going to be where we have bile salts and vitamins start to absorb within our bloodstream. And we're also going to send food into the large intestines through an area known as the ileocecal valve. This helps to ensure that the food within the small intestines moves in a one-way direction into our large intestines. So let's dive into a bit more detail of what we discussed when it came to our duodenum. So we have 2, or technically 3 organs that are going to help secrete bile and digestive enzymes. We'll start with the pancreas here. Our pancreas creates digestive enzymes that it is going to move through a duct. That duct is known as our main pancreatic duct. We also have an accessory pancreatic duct, and it puts it right into the duodenum here. And that is going to include one of the enzymes known as pancreatic lipase that hydrolyzes fat into glycerol and fatty acids. We'll also have a pancreatic amylase to help break down our carbs. And then I don't have it listed here, but we do have a ton of other peptidases that are going to break down proteins, and they're going to have fancy names like trypsin and chymotrypsin and all of that, but we'll save that for a more advanced class. And then we have our liver and our gallbladder that is going to bring down bile into the duodenum through this duct, and that bile is going to help to emulsify fat, meaning that we'll have mechanical digestion because the fat droplets will disperse within the water so that we can expose it to more lipase. And the lipase, remember, is coming in from the pancreas. I included this little image down here just to show you the breakdown of some of these larger macromolecules into their smaller components. So here we see our carbs are being broken down into our disaccharides and then into our simple sugars such as glucose, and it moves right through our epithelial cell that lines the small intestines and into our blood capillary. Then we have our proteins that get broken down into bipeptidases like trypsin into smaller components, eventually into amino acids that also move through the epithelial lining cell and into our bloodstream. But notice with our fats, here are fat globules, and we are going to use bile salts in order to emulsify them, and then they are going to be broken down by our lipase into our monoglycerides and free fatty acids. It moves through the cell through something known as a chylomicron and into our lymphatic system. We're going to learn about these in a different class, but just something to keep in the back of your head is that these are going to be called lacteals. Okay, so let's talk about the lining of the small intestines. I already mentioned the epithelial cells that we're going to find within the mucosa of the small intestines, but notice how when we look at the small intestines from a larger view, we can see that it's highly folded. And it's not only what we can see here in the illustration, but even when we move into the microscopic level, we see that there are these finger-like projections called villi. And these villi within them are going to contain our blood capillaries, and then that lymphatic capillary, which I mentioned, is called a lacteal. And so let's now zoom in on one of these little portions of a villus. Okay, we see it here in a histology form, but notice how down here it's even more magnified. So here is our villus, and on those little epithelial cells, we'll see that we have these brush-like extensions known as microvilli. And the microvilli create this fuzzy look to it called a brush border, and they're there to do two things. We need to increase the surface area so that we can absorb more nutrients, and it helps increase our absorption efficiency of nutrients, mostly because we contain brush border enzymes that complete the digestion process. So these are important elements in allowing our small intestines to really gain our nutrients that we can utilize for cellular processes. All right, so this slide has a bunch of images here, but I wanted to kind of piece everything together for you in a systematic way. So we talked about the lining in the small intestines and the little villi. We could see those villi over here. And we have our blood vessels that are going to absorb our carbs and our proteins, and our lacteals that are going to absorb the fats, utilizing the microvilli that sit on top of each of these little cells. So as we are doing this, we have to think about how the blood is traveling. So let's back up just a little bit. And I want you to think about blood supply to these digestive organs. So we don't have to memorize any of these artery or veins names, but know that we are sending oxygenated blood to all of these organs, right? We need to give oxygen to those tissues. So when we give off that oxygen, these organs are going to utilize the oxygen. And as we're absorbing nutrients, and I'm going to flip to this little image over here. So here is, let's say, our intestines. So we're giving off the oxygen here in the capillary bed within the intestines. And we are going to give the oxygen to the tissue and then pick up carbon dioxide. But while we pick up that carbon dioxide, we are also picking up nutrients. So now we're going to travel through this vein that has oxygen poor and nutrient-rich blood. And from there, we are going to send it to the liver, where we are going to give off some of those nutrients so that we can store it and send our now poor oxygenated blood, nutrient poor blood back into venous circulation to make its way back to the heart. So here we can see an image showing all of the organs where we have the nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor blood. And notice how we are traveling first through a vessel known as the hepatic portal vein to take it to the liver. Now, that's one of the only blood vessel names I really want you to know for this lecture. Is this hepatic portal vein is going to contain nutrient-rich but oxygen-poor blood that travels over to the stomach, to the liver, and then we are going to take that blood through what we call hepatic veins and put it into our inferior vena cava, which takes it back to the heart. I like this image here because it gives a nice summary of the full process that I talked about, where we are moving oxygenated blood through the aorta and then through these arteries, and these are arteries that supply our digestive organs like the celiac artery, superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. We're giving off oxygen to these digestive organs. Meanwhile, they're giving the capillaries here nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor blood that we are going to carry through our vessels draining these organs. So these are named the same. We would call them inferior and superior mesenteric veins. And then we have special names for other ones like the splenic vein and gastric veins and things like that. But all of them are going to empty into our hepatic portal vein. So once again, we contain nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor blood traveling to the liver. Our liver takes those nutrients, and we now have oxygen-poor and nutrient-poor blood going through hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava, which then travels back to the heart. So that was a little bit extra content, but I really wanted you to understand this full circle, and also make a note that our liver, once it receives this nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor blood, it's also going to remove any toxic substances that would include drugs, alcohol, and pathogens. And now for our large intestines. This is going to resorb water from our undigested food, and we're going to process our waste material. And it's going to include structures known as the cecum, and this in the teal will be called our colon, and then the rectum. So notice how the diameter of our large intestines is wider. So it's larger than the small intestines, but it's going to be shorter in length. Food will move into the large intestines through that ileocecal valve that we described earlier into this blind pouch known as the cecum. And coming off of the cecum is going to be this organ known as the vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm, so anatomists thought this looked like a little worm hanging off of the cecum. And it is going to help fight infections. We do have lymphatic tissue in here, and there's still research being done as to why we have this appendix. Now, sometimes it can get inflamed and cause peritonitis, which is going to be a life-threatening infection of the peritoneum. You will feel pain within this area known as McBurney's point. If you go to a structure known as the AHS, anterior superior iliac spine of our hip, this is also that bone that kind of pops out of your hip, and draw a line over to close to the area of the navel, the belly button. We are going to go about 1/3 the way, and that's known as McBurney's point. And that is typically where we make an incision to remove the inflamed appendix as well. Now let's talk about the colon a bit more. The colon is going to include the ascending colon, which moves up the right side of our abdomen, the transverse colon, which travels from right to left, and then our descending colon, which passes down the left side of the abdomen, and then into a sigmoid colon, which is kind of a loop. Sometimes our fecal contents get impacted within this region, and then we are going to have it move into the rectum. The rectum will open up at the anus, where defecation of that feces will pass through using our process of peristalsis. Now, our anal canal consists of two different sphincters. We have one that is known as our internal sphincter. You could see it pictured over here. It's the muscle within the wall here, and it is going to be involuntary, whereas our external anal sphincter out here is voluntary because it's made up of skeletal muscle. Now, our colon is also going to be home for a lot of our good bacteria, our intestinal flora that will help us with absorbing certain nutrients and also will produce certain vitamins for us. And in the colon, we've said it before, we're going to extract water and mineral salts from our undigested food and store our waste material to then later be defecated. And then just a quick note on our accessory organs. We've talked about these organs a bit already, but we know that they are going to assist in adding secretions or enzymes to help catabolize our food into nutrients. So this will include the salivary glands that we discussed in the oral cavity, our liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. So our liver is the largest gland in our body. It has a role in digestion of fats and also detoxifying blood. It's going to produce bile and processes our vitamins and fats, and also synthesizes our plasma proteins. And I kind of wish I put gallbladder right below that, because our liver is going to send down bile, and then whatever we don't use is going to be moved back and stored within the gallbladder. So our gallbladder here will also help to concentrate bile salts. But whenever we eat something fatty, let's say we eat a juicy, greasy hamburger, that is going to have fat within it, and our body senses the fat within the duodenum, and it will release bile from the gallbladder and the liver in order to emulsify that fat. Our pancreas is going to help secrete digestive enzymes and also bicarbonate so that we can neutralize the acidic chyme that moves from the stomach into the duodenum. So that's it for section 1. Let me know if you have any questions.